Fuddruckers. Now that is just a fun word to say. It's the name of a once popular hamburger chain that hasn't been doing too well. They have had so many ups and downs over the years that I'm going to touch on, but right away, to prove that they've been struggling, at their biggest, they had well over 200 locations. Texas has always been their biggest market, but they were spread out into most states across the country. Today, they have been reduced to less than 100 locations, spread across only 23 states. Obviously, a sizable reduction to about half of their previous size, meaning there is a good chance that the Fuddruckers near you has closed down over the past few years. Further evidence of their struggle would be in 2010, they filed for bankruptcy, and then about 10 years later, in 2020, it was looking like they might shut down entirely before they were able to find a buyer that had interest in saving the brand. This has been an eventful story. Fuddruckers has had 8 different owners over their 40-plus year history, so I think the best way to highlight their ups and downs would be to go through all 8 of them and talk about some of the big things that were happening around those times. Starting off in 1980 with the founder himself, Phil Romano. He graduated from Florida Atlantic University, FAU, in the 1960s and quickly got involved in the operation and even ownership of various restaurants. In the 1970s, he moved to Texas to further pursue those same passions, and by 1980, he had a promising idea for a new restaurant concept. It was based on the idea that people would be willing to pay for a burger that was higher quality than you would see at a typical fast food place, but not quite going overboard into the casual dining territory. Remember, this was before Chipotle and Panera and the explosion of the whole fast casual middle ground, so these were original ideas. In his own words, "I thought the world needed a better hamburger," and if you know anything about Fuddruckers, to this day, you'll know that they take a lot of pride in their hamburgers. In fact, believe it or not, they serve the world's greatest hamburgers, and that's not my own personal review, it's a claim that the company has been making non-stop since the 1980s. I mean, it's all over their website, their signs, their logo, and yes, that's obviously a bold claim. It always reminds me of when Buddy the Elf sees the world's best cup of coffee, but I will say that they do appear to put a lot of care into their hamburgers. So Phil Romano went out, bought an old bank in San Antonio, Texas, and converted it into a restaurant that was selling the world's greatest hamburgers, or at the very least, a higher quality hamburger when compared to most fast food restaurants. The original name, I love this, he called it Freddy Fuddruckers, obviously dropping the Freddy part early on, but could you imagine someone having the legal name Freddy Fuddrucker? That would be incredible, and to be clear, it was never someone's actual name. It was rumored to be inspired by a fictional airline called a Fuddrucker, but I believe more than anything else it's just a goofy name to try to catch people's attention. About a year and a half later, Romano opened the second Fuddruckers in Houston, Texas, and about a year and a half after that, they had their first change in ownership. In 1983, they had a public stock offering that raised the money that they needed to start opening so many more restaurants. I do want to point out that Phil Romano did remain the majority owner, but this was like the start of him removing himself further and further away from the company. In 1985, he stepped down from his CEO position, and by the end of that decade, he left the board of directors and sold most of his ownership in favor of moving on to start new restaurant concepts. The most notable one of those would probably be Romano's Macaroni Grill that you may know from the dozens of US locations. But back to Fuddruckers, they were now becoming a well-known brand because they had the resources to open new restaurants in new cities, but maybe even more importantly, they were utilizing a franchising system. That's basically where others pay them for the rights to operate locations using their brand and their food. All things that helped Fuddruckers grow to over 100 locations within the next 4 years, which may have been a little fast. I would consider that to be their first stumble. They were overextended and started to lose money, but they laid off some of their staff and sold some company-owned locations to the franchisees, and that loosened things up enough to reverse the trend. Their next change in ownership happened in 1988 when they merged with a company called DACA International. Now, that company would specialize in food service contracts. Specifically, they were one of the country's largest operators of cafeterias. They would have them in places like universities and hospitals. The two of them seemed like a good fit because combining would make them more efficient as far as food purchasing and select operations. One of the big attractions of Fuddruckers has always been their toppings bar. Similar to a cafeteria style, they give you a plain burger and then you take it over to that area and put all the toppings you want on it. It's a fun way to do it that gives the customer more power of exactly what they're eating, and it saves money because there's never been a need to employ servers. DACA was in charge of Fuddruckers for almost a decade, and during that time, the brand became considerably more well-known, almost doubling in size, approaching 200 locations. In fact, in the mid-1990s, there were a dozen Home Depots that contained a smaller version of Fuddruckers called Fuddruckers Express inside of them. They didn't last long because the whole idea turned out out to be a disaster. Really, everything for Fuddruckers started going wrong around that time. Some of it was a similar issue. They were opening locations too fast, causing them to make poor decisions in real estate, but also they believed that there was consumer confusion over the Fuddruckers' core concept of the world's greatest hamburger. Let me explain that a little further. I would say that the best argument that can be given for these actually being the world's greatest hamburgers is the fact that they are so fresh. I mean, objectively, I don't think you can make a hamburger much fresher than this. Going all the way back to the first hamburgers at that first location, they have been known for having a section labeled butcher shop and a section labeled bakery, not to mention the toppings bar. I think Phil Romano realized that if you're going to make such a bold claim, you're going to have to back it up with some evidence. So with all of this going on, people could see that the meat was cut and ground daily at the restaurants, and that the buns were baked from scratch daily at the restaurants, and that all the vegetables were visibly fresh. But by the middle of the 1990s, they stopped emphasizing all of this stuff, partially by changing the layout of the restaurants so that all of a sudden, the world's greatest burger was starting to seem more like an empty claim. And on top of that, the investors feared that DACA was having their attention pulled in too many different directions, given the fact that they also own the cafeteria business and two other restaurant chains called Champs and Great Bagel and Coffee. The next change in ownership is a very brief technical change. In 1997, DACA International basically split apart. They sold their cafeteria business and spun off their restaurants into a newly formed company called Unique Casual Restaurants. But by the following year, there was already another change. In 1998, Fuddruckers was sold to King Cannon, which was a private company owned by a popular figure in the restaurant business named Michael Cannon. The price he paid was $43 million, and he was willing to invest even more money to try to shake things up and bring some life back into the brand. He introduced this rock and roll theme that was quickly adopted by all of the company-owned restaurants. There were updates and renovations. He expanded the menu items, all things that did help bring attention to the brand. But by 2010, things had gone poorly yet again. Now, being a private company during this whole time makes it hard to pinpoint exactly where things took a turn, but I have to think that lower sales from the recession would likely be a big factor here, especially considering that Fuddruckers has always been the more expensive, premium alternative to the more popular, cheaper fast food restaurants. I'm just saying, when money is tight and you want a hamburger, you're more likely to go to a place like McDonald's than a place like Fuddruckers. That right there is when they filed for bankruptcy, an event that quickly led to two more changes in ownership. Straight out of that bankruptcy, their assets were bought for $40 million by a private equity firm called Tavistock. Again, not among the most important changes on the list, because about a month later, those assets were resold, this time for $61 million, and the new owner was another popular restaurant chain called Luby's, that I have to admit seems like another good fit. Oddly enough, Luby's is known for their cafeteria-style food. I know they keep coming back to that. They were also founded in San Antonio, with their biggest market still being in Texas, and they had somewhat of a different customer base. Luby's is more traditional and intended for adults, but Fuddruckers has for a long time found success by attracting families and children. Going back to 1990, they had a great idea by starting this promotion where kids could eat for free Monday through Thursday after 4 p.m. Those were the hours where they were having trouble getting business, and it was effective. They even provided things like balloons and video games. The specifics vary based on the location, but Fuddruckers grew this reputation of being a fun place for kids. So then, that motivated Luby's to try out these dual concept locations, with the idea being that the adults would want to go to Luby's while the kids would want to go to Fuddruckers, so that building would be like the best of both worlds. There was a big vision in bringing these two companies together that once again, unfortunately, never truly came together in the way that many people had hoped. Luby's was already dealing with falling sales and high debt before they spent the $60 million to buy Fuddruckers, and then they spent another $11 million to buy Cheeseburger in Paradise, effectively combining three restaurant chains that were having trouble. Most of the Cheeseburger and Paradises were quickly shut down or converted into Fuddruckers. By 2018, same-store sales were consistently dropping across the board, motivating them to close locations along the way. We can say that the expected efficiencies didn't turn out to be all that efficient. We can say that the cafeteria-style restaurants in general were declining because they were no longer preferred by customers, or we can say that the multiple chains were still being held down by financial and operational issues stemming back years earlier. And all of that was happening before the pandemic. I don't think I have to tell you that it exaggerated all of their issues, and by the middle of 2020, major changes needed to happen. That's where it was looking like it might have been the end of Fuddruckers, but in 2021, they did find a buyer that was willing to try and save the brand. Back to the list, the new owner is Black Titan Franchise Systems, a franchisee of theirs that is owned by Nicholas Perkins. For $18.5 million, he took control of the remaining 92 Fuddruckers locations. It was actually a deal that made him the first African American with 100% ownership of a national burger franchise. It does seem to be at least somewhat personally motivated, but he says he believes in the strength of the franchisees and that he has big plans to stabilize the brand, reposition it, and eventually make it grow again. So it's not necessarily the end of Fuddruckers just yet anyway, though they have been kind of circling down the drain for quite a while. Let me know in the comments, what do you see for the future of Fuddruckers? You wouldn't think that the restaurant that has the world's greatest hamburger would be going through so much trouble. So do you think it's enough to save them and keep them stable, or do you even agree that it is in fact the world's greatest